My name is Peter McPherson. I'm president of APLU, and I'm happy to welcome this very large crowd and our excellent panel. It's important that we have events like this. Women do so much more, so much important in this society, and obviously huge potential beyond. Today, we're going to be talking about STEM, where the potential is especially important and present. So I welcome all of you. I'm sure we will have an excellent panel. Thank you, panelists, for being here.
Thank you, Peter. My name is Jess Bennett. I am the Director of STEM Education at APLU, and I'm so glad we're all able to pause in our day-to-day work of making public universities great to celebrate Women's History Month and to focus in particular on an area where women's success and advancement still seems to hit snags, the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM. Despite decades of effort to increase women's engagement in STEM careers, we still have significant strides to make to ensure our STEM workforce reflects the diversity of our nations and to ensure that our women students and faculty in STEM are supported and successful. We've gathered today a cadre of women leaders at our member universities who by action, example, and commitment are helping to tackle this challenge. Let me introduce our panelists. These brief introductions cannot fully capture the many ways our panelists serve their institutions, their disciplines, their communities, and our collective efforts as public research universities, but we'll try. Gail Murphy is Professor of Computer Science and Vice President of Research and Innovation at the University of British Columbia. She is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a Fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery. She is the co-founder and former chief scientist of Tap Technologies, a technology company based in her own research focused on supporting and boosting team software engineering and knowledge work. Susanna Rivera-Mills is Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at Ball State University. She is a first-generation college student whose research focuses on Latino communities, Spanish language and culture, sociolinguistics, and online teaching and learning. She also leads several projects and programs focused on expanding women's leadership in higher education. Sharon Tethica is Director of the Center for Black Studies Research at UC Santa Barbara and co-lead of UC Santa Barbara's Aspire iChange team. Her goals as a researcher and practitioner are to broaden participation for students of color in STEM disciplines. She previously served as a program officer at the National Science Foundation in the Division of Research on Learning and Computer and Information Science and Engineering. Heather Wilson is president of the University of Texas at El Paso. She previously served as the Secretary of the United States Air Force and the president of the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. A former member of the United States Congress representing New Mexico, Dr. Wilson now serves on the National Science Board and chairs the Women in Aviation Advisory Board of the Federal Aviation Administration. These are some impressive women. We're going to begin our conversation with prepared questions for the panelists. We'll do our best to make time toward the end of our session for audience questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit the question and we'll queue them up and bring them to the panelists at the end. All right, so we're gonna get started here. With the recent election of our first woman vice president of the United States, women and girls have been hearing and repeating the phrase, "Wear your sneakers, there's glass everywhere." Can you share your experiences with breaking through glass ceilings on the path to your current roles? And how have those experiences shaped how you show up as a leader? And I'm gonna ask President Wilson to kick us off.
I love that. When I first read that about wear your sneakers, it just cracked me up laughing. I just loved it. But so I was in the third class with women to go to the United States Air Force Academy. And so I was the first person in my family to go to college. I got a one-way ticket to Colorado Springs, Colorado. My father and my grandfather were flyers. My grandfather flew in the First World War, and in the Second World War, he flew with the Wasps. He knew women flyers in the Second World War. And that kind of, in some ways, helped his, he had 5 grandsons and me, so so it opened some doors that way for me. But I arrived at the Air Force Academy, you get off the bus, they start yelling at you and telling you to stand on the X and don't look left or right. And then they march you up this ramp, which at the time leads up to that beautiful campus at the Air Force Academy, dominated by that chapel with 17 spires. And but over that ramp, in big aluminum letters, it said, "Bring me men." And, and that it's the first line of a wonderful, beautiful poem, but it took over 25 years for them to take the sign down off the ramp. And now it just has the Air Force core values there. Integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. But at the time, as women, we kind of laughed about it and things. But the third class with women, we weren't the first ones, so there wasn't a bright light on our class. But the third class, the seniors when I was there were still all male. And there were still a lot of people who thought we shouldn't be there. And so you had that feeling that you didn't just have to succeed at a very difficult university, but you had to change other people's attitudes at the same time about whether you should be there in the first place. And I've always had this kind of funky lower voice. And so there were times where, you'd take criticism or cheap shots. So I hope that helped open the doors for other women to go to the academy and not feel like they were imposters or there for the wrong reason. But I'm glad they finally took the sign down.
Vice President Murphy, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, it's pretty hard to follow that. I think I'm really lucky that in terms of the role I'm currently in, as a VP of Research and Innovation, there's been multiple women before me at UBC. And so I really got to step into a role that was already, the ceiling was broken, shall we say. I do have this other sort of side of being an entrepreneur. And I think there's more of a feeling that you're the only woman around the table, or you might go to an industry conference and you're one of like 3 out of 600 women in the crowd, which is great because you don't have to line up for the washroom, which is fantastic. But, I think there it was really drawing on the fact that my parents never said I have a sister, there wasn't anything we couldn't do. So it was just a matter of really believing in what I wanted to do and continuing to forge forward, and having a lot of male colleagues that were just so welcoming at ensuring that there was different voices around the table and that there was space for everybody to make a difference.
Thank you. Provost Rivera-Mills.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I love those stories that my colleagues have shared because they resonate with me, certainly. And when I read this question, I thought I should have worn my pearls to go with my sneakers, right? Because they go hand in hand. But this is a great question. And like many of us, I think I'm a first generation college student. So that was the first sort of glass ceiling for me to break, just in terms of my own personal lineage and my family. Also being Latina, I come from a different culture where there are very defined gender roles. And I had to step out of those in some way to be able to achieve what I had to achieve. Currently, I am the first Latina provost at my institution. And in between those two bookends, I've had many experiences where I have walked into a room and I have been the only Latina there. And I think all those experiences have shaped me and my leadership in the sense that it has made me increasingly aware of the responsibility that I carry as a leader. At some point in my journey in leadership, I realized that being a leader went well beyond me, beyond myself. Not only do I represent who I represent when I walk into a room simply because of the way that I look, but I also represent the voices that aren't there. And so I have developed and internalized a mechanism where when I walk into a room, it takes me all of 5 seconds to look around and sort of assess who's not there. what voices might be missing, what perspectives are missing, and then how can I strategically step into the privilege of being in that room so that I can make sure that I bring those voices with me, that I bring those perspectives with me, and that I begin to carve out a path, not just in the present, but always mindful of those that will come after me as well. So I think that there is a sense of privilege that comes with knowing that you are the first. There is a sense of responsibility and accountability that you have to those that have gone before you and those that will come after you. And for me, there's just a keen awareness of that present moment and who is there, who is not there, and how can we make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible in that current moment in order to advance whatever that goal might be in that room, for not just my own agenda, but obviously the agenda that is much broader and more collective as we move forward.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Tettegah.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here and just listening to everyone's story. You know, it's just amazing that we are here, despite the obstacles and despite the signs that say we shouldn't be here. And I think we see that with the election of the current president, vice president, I'm sorry. But as a Black woman, of course, it's been a very interesting path. And I would say I didn't break through the glass ceiling. I used a torch and I melted the glass down and I eased in and nobody saw me coming. And I think that's been my experience in this process, because it's so many times that I've been the only one in the room. And it really made me think about how can I bring others along with me? It's so important to make sure that we pass on the knowledge and pass on the process of how we can get in that room. And sometimes you may have to break it and sometimes you may have to melt it down. As we all know, it's not an easy process in certain areas, in many ways, and especially in STEM. I look around me and often when I go to meetings, I am the only one. I really am. And it's been like that for a very long time. From the beginning, since I had an interest as a young kid at 7 years old, and I can talk about that story later, on how I was interested in STEM and how that glass was pulled up right in front of me. But now I'm back. I made a 360-degree turn and putting my efforts forward to make sure that I mentor students and ensure that they also follow along that path. That's very important to me. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing those stories. We can't be who we can't see. Who served as an inspiration, as role models, or as mentors to you in your career? And what advice or lessons did you gain from those mentors that helped you through particularly challenging moments, experiences, or just are those nuggets of wisdom you keep in your hand from day to day? We're going to start actually this time with Dr. Tettegah.
You know, along the way, I had many mentors. My third grade teacher was a mentor for my sister and I. She was able to expose us to a lot of different things in life and made us believe in ourselves, to give us that self-efficacy that where no one can really tear you down. And I would say that that's the most important thing that came from my mentors, is believing in me and me believing that I had the self-efficacy to persevere no matter what. And I would say that it has been challenging from the time I mentioned. I started out as an undergraduate in computer science and math and logic. And I say I was a casualty of STEM in many ways, because I was at an all women's college where no one looked like me. I was literally the only Black woman in the college. And that didn't feel good to me. I needed that social support. And I ended up leaving the all women's college and going to a larger university where I couldn't triple major. And that, I would say, had an effect upon my career. But I met people there that were great mentors for me, that gave me encouragement and said to continue. It stirred me away in certain fields. I kind of went astray for a minute, but I knew that STEM has always been my passion. As I mentioned, since I was 7 years old, I picked up a book about microorganisms at 7 at the library and decided I was going to be a scientist at that point. And here I am, I'm back, and I'm mentoring people in this area, and it makes me really feel good about it. to know that I'm carrying on that legacy of mentoring and being a role model for others, women and underrepresented groups specifically.
Thank you. Provost Rivera-Mills.
Yes, thank you. Like Sharon, I think that when I think back at my mentors, I do think back to my K-12 years. And I know that the first mentor I can think back to was my math teacher in junior high. And he just inspired me and empowered me to be able to do math at a level that I didn't even know I could. His name was Rudy Diaz. And then in high school, it was my Spanish teacher, Lucy Quimby. Interestingly enough, at the time, I didn't realize how important it was to see yourself in role models. It isn't until now, as I look back, that I realized that the two people I was most attracted to and most inspired by happened to be Latinos themselves. And that didn't click then, but it clearly mattered very much. Then professionally, I have to say, I have not had the joy of having a woman mentor. All my mentors have been men, and that's not to say that's a bad thing, because clearly they were wonderful partners and mentors to me. But I think that as I thought about that and the fact that all of my professional mentors have been men, that speaks to the ongoing lack of women in positions that can do peer mentoring in higher ed. And I think that that's an ongoing concern. And it's one of the reasons that I certainly take mentoring very seriously for other emerging leaders that are coming up. And I think that that's certainly a need. As far as those wisdom nuggets that I carry with me all the time, two words. One of them that I took away was authenticity, the importance of authenticity. And the other one is intentionality. And I think the authenticity was so important to me because, you know, we all suffer from imposter syndrome. We all suffer from hearing many voices that are constantly telling us who we need to be in any particular position or how we need to develop certain personas. And it was really powerful when I realized that the best you can be is to be yourself, to be authentic, to be true to the values that guide you, to be clear about what grounds you as a leader, as a woman scientist, as a faculty, whatever position you might have, and to make sure that you're living up to that authentic self. And then in terms of intentionality, what I have noticed in my own experience is many times women in particular happen into leadership accidentally. We're the ones that are generally called to clean up a mess that nobody else wants to clean up, or we're placed in situations where no one wants to have that position for a number of reasons. And we find ourselves being the ones that are there to kind of figure out what to do. And I think that going from being accidentally placed in those positions to intentionally navigating the path and creating the path that you want to have by seeking the right connections, the right support network, the right mentors, by positioning yourself in the right place for future opportunities, can really make a huge difference in what that path ultimately looks like for you. So both authenticity and intentionality have really been important. It's something I always keep in the back of my mind even now as I look at what I do and why I do it.
Thank you. Vice President Murphy?
Well, I think I'm going to pick up on some of those themes because I'm sure we've all experienced them, but really I will come back to the point about being authentic because I think it's one thing I've learned through a number of mentors and has been really important. Two people I would single out are actually Maria Clave, who's now president of Harvey Mudd, and Martha Piper, who was president of UBC for almost 3 terms in an interesting way. But both of them shared their stories along the way when I had a chance to talk with them. And they were really important because they shared the good parts and the bad parts. And I think understanding what that leadership path looks like and that it's not all roses along the pathway, that there's going to be some hard times is an interesting thing and an important thing to remember, and to remember that you need to draw on your authentic self at that moment in time. So in terms of 2 stories that I would sort of quickly relate towards that point, I remember Martha Piper standing up at a Senate meeting when we had been having some difficult times on our campus with respect to sexual harassment. And Martha stood up at Senate and just said, I will not accept it on this campus. And I think it was a definitive statement. It was authentically who she was. And it was just very straightforward. And I think I learned a lot about that, of drawing on your values and just being clear in stating those values as part of your leadership. And the second one I'd mention is when I started in this role, I had some rocky times for the first few months. I think as many of us step into something where we're not necessarily sure what it is and how to navigate the path, and was feeling a bit rocky about how things were going, and spoke with someone who had been on the search committee. And they at some point just said, look, you're not going to do it like other people did it. You're going to do it like you're going to do it. And we chose you for a reason. And I think that that really stuck, and it kind of provided some freedom to say, I don't have to be second guessing everything I do. I just have to be really clear about what the campus needs, what I'm hearing from the campus, what we can take forward, and work collaboratively as a community to really make things better for the environment as a whole on campus.
Thank you. And President Wilson.
I've had a variety of mentors along the way, and role models really, but and some of them were teachers. A fantastic high school physics teacher who I stayed in touch with for many years, who had finally convinced me that if I was pushing on the wall was pushing back. I mean, that made no sense to me in high school, but I guess as a story, I would highlight when I was shortly out of graduate school, I worked for a man named Larry Leger, and I was terrified of him, but he had been Maxwell Taylor's jump master over Normandy on D-Day. He was a West Point graduate, chain-smoking Boston Red Sox fan, gruff as they came, but had been worse in his younger years, apparently, which was, I just couldn't imagine that. But he spent a lot of time helping people on to what they wanted to do next, because he believed that by doing that, good people would always want to work for him. And the second thing I learned from him was that he always hired people in teams. He always looked at what the team needed. And he matched me up. He said, you're young and eager. I'm matching you up with someone who's experienced and has a lot more wisdom than you do. Learn from him. And I, of course, said, yes, sir. But the lessons to me in those things were really about hiring people as teams. That as leaders, and we've all hired dozens of people over the years, you get to that point, and we call it it's like the potato head time, right? Where you want that person's nose and this person's ears. And in reality, the team needs different gifts at different times. And so trying to pull those different gifts together to make a team that can get the job done. And I probably learned that from Larry Leger. I would say that as a leader, one of the things that I think I'm conscious of that maybe my mentors were not, and that I like to be explicit about, is balancing work and life. Sometimes as women leaders, we were brought up to not mention the fact that we have a family and the kids are sick and we've got to get to the daycare at 5:30. Everybody faces those circumstances. And by acknowledging people's devotion to their families and the ability to balance these things, you can often attract exceptional people to continue to work with you who wouldn't stay and wouldn't just give it all because in other places that wasn't valued. And so, yeah, I'm a parent, and I talk about the fact that I'm talking about my family at work, and I encourage other people to do the same, because families matter. And if you can balance work and life, that's one of the things that brings joy to life. And so I think as leaders and as women, we need to be a little bit less self-conscious about talking about that with other women in the workplace and other men.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing those stories of your mentors and their wisdom that they passed on to you. I'm going to pivot us to a slightly different topic here. And I'm going to ask everyone to respond to this. I think we're good on time for everyone weighing in. Just this month, we've marked the 1-year anniversary of COVID-19, dramatically changing how we live, work, and educate. During the past year, we've seen numerous stories documenting the career impacts of COVID-19, especially on women. This includes women withdrawing from the workforce entirely, or in academia, having their scholarly contributions stop or slow due to caretaking responsibilities. What recommendations might you all make to fellow university leaders to support their women faculty during our collective recovery from COVID-19 and beyond? And I'm going to ask Vice President Murphy to start us off.
Sure. Well, I mean, what a difficult year for everyone, for our students, for our faculty, for our staff, obviously for everyone in our countries. We've done a lot of listening at UBC and tried to do a lot of different actions that I think are going on in many institutions, extending the tenure clock, listening and trying to make daycare hours more accessible, trying to work around issues like that. There's two things being on the research side that I'm particularly worried about. One is that the impacts are not just going to be over as soon as we have vaccinations and herd immunity. They're going to continue. And they're going to continue in a way that is not going to be easy for people to talk about or maybe to recognize. Perhaps it's a son or daughter that's having a difficult time through the pandemic and takes time to get back on track. Perhaps you have relatives that have been affected by the disease and are continuing to struggle with it. So I think we have to recognize that there's not going to be a magic day where we're all back on campus and everything's just great. There's going to be long-lasting effects, and we need to keep the conversation going with our faculty and our students and to understand what we need to continue to do to recognize the impacts. Another thing that I'm particularly worried about is that scholarly outputs piece and how the community at large sees it. Academia revolves around peer review, but we know that it's not always easy to get our peer reviewers to perhaps take into account people's context and circumstances as they evaluate a grant or as they evaluate a publication or as they evaluate a tenure package. And so how are we going to get our community at large, if we're allowed to write something about the impacts of us from the pandemic, how do we get reviewers to really take that into account and to really reflect upon it and what it means for someone that they were impacted in a very severe way? I think we're already seeing instances where people are getting some pushback on those kinds of statements. And so now's the time that I think we need to dig in as national, international communities of scholarly activity and really try to figure out how we can ensure that people are treated appropriately, fairly, and with compassion and empathy as we move forward.
Thank you. Provost Rivera-Mills?
Yes, I really appreciate, Gail, the fact that you started your comments by saying that you have done a lot of listening. I think the listening piece cannot be underestimated. And that's because even though it is clear that COVID has had a negative impact and that it has exacerbating inequities that were already in place, that impact has not been the same for everybody. Even though people have been impacted, disciplines have been impacted in different ways, individuals were impacted in different ways. Some have claimed that they have actually been more productive than they were in the past. Others clearly were not able to access labs, et cetera. So one of the things we did early on here was to create a mechanism so that we could help faculty return as quickly as possible to their research on campus. And that happened for us last summer, where we had to be very careful around safety protocols, space use. You all know the checklist by now, to try to figure out how to get faculty the access they needed to spaces that were critical to the research. Then we had established an advisory council on scholarship for our research office. That council became incredibly valuable because we were able to charge that group, which had representation from across campus, to look at best practices to actually help us problem solve and determine how can we support faculty while doing a lot of that listening that you were talking about internally as well as to what people needed. Their recommendations and their best practices were all placed into a document that then I shared with all the campus leadership so that they would be aware of what these practices are, and they could also begin to evaluate the current policies and determine what policies needed to be adapted, both for the short term, but as you pointed out, Gail, this isn't just a short-term challenge, also thinking about the long term. And that included some of the things that you have heard. It included providing a mechanism for documenting these disruptions, such as a COVID-19 impact statement, so that people could begin to tell their story, to provide the context that would serve them not just now, but in the future as well. We also wanted to provide guidance around what that documentation should look like. We were very clear that we didn't want this to just be an opportunity of all the reasons why I wasn't able to do something, but an opportunity that really spoke to how have we risen to the challenge as faculty members? How did we adapt? How did we become flexible? What did we have to shift, change, reimagine, invent, and really empower people to speak to the things that they were able to do in order to face the challenges and not just what they were not able to do. In addition, we also have encouraged people to think about new methods of assessing someone's scholarship, someone's work, someone's teaching, and to focus when you do document, not just on the outcomes, but the efforts, looking at and considering perhaps conference papers that were accepted through a peer review process, but were not able to be delivered for some reason. That was particularly important for faculty in the arts for us, performances that were ready to go, gallery showings that were ready to go, that were canceled at the last minute. It was important for us to talk about how do you give credit for that effort and that work as well. And also provide training even for the committees that evaluate promotion and tenure. Because again, this is something different. So how are we collectively thinking about that? What principles should guide us now? And what are some of those best practices that we should think about as being just best practices, period, not just COVID exceptions? So I think all of those conversations need to be ongoing. And because we know that one size does not fit all, and as a matter of fact, we need to be very careful because some of the things we might do might have unintended consequences, such as stopping the clock. There has been a lot of research around how that, even though it's helpful for some, could be detrimental for others if it's applied across the board. We want to make sure that we continue the conversations, that we provide a menu of options that can be integrated into existing processes, and that we also continuously review our policies from leaves to stopping the clock, to how we do promotion and tenure, to how we educate and inform external reviews, et cetera, as ways of figuring out how to navigate. I also think, we know, and we often talk about how mentoring is important, but I have to tell you that now more than ever, mentoring for faculty is vital. Some of our faculty may find themselves in a situation where they literally have to reinvent their research, pivot and change direction. And they're going to need that mentoring. And I'm not just talking about the one-on-one mentoring. I'm talking about how do we create an environment where there's professional development available on campus. So one of the things I miss very much about conferences and attending conference is that not only the wealth of information that we share when we go to conferences and network and talk to each other, but because we are so busy day to day, that when you travel to a conference, you actually create a space where you can focus on what's being shared in that conference and think through creatively solutions that maybe you don't have time to think about every day. And so now what I have found is, even though I attend virtual conferences, I realize that I don't have that creative space where I can really carve that out of my schedule, because unfortunately many of us are attending the conference, but also answering something that is coming up that requires our attention. So how do we create that space within our campuses so that our faculty can come together and think through some of these issues that are clearly relevant to them and they value, and share that? How do we create opportunities to present work that they have not been able to present elsewhere? How do we work through writing groups? How do we look at group sharing, group mutual mentoring, and provide those opportunities that before, they were there, but certainly now, my experience has been that as you provide that, the attendance has increased twofold for us, because I think people really are seeking that. And then how do we help people truly collaborate on things like scholarship, where they might be able to take advantage of archival data, not just within our university, but in collaborations with other universities? How can we make sure that we are providing interdisciplinary teams, but interinstitutional teams that can really position themselves well for what we know will continue to become a very competitive situation with federal grant submissions and funding, et cetera. So I think that there are a number of things that we need to be considering and providing a menu of options, because different people will be supported and helped in different ways.
I feel like that was a mic drop answer. Dr. Tettegah or Dr. Wilson, do either of you want to add anything else to what's been already shared here?
I would. I would like to talk about just a little bit different. It's talking about other ways that we can support women at the institutions who've been affected. It's not just children that individuals are caretaking for, it's also other family members. And I think we haven't, considered that. But to me, one of the most important is figuring out ways to get rid of these cemented practices that I see at many of the institutions, and the lack of flexibility. And also, I think it's important, especially for COVID, that people get mental health support. And that is so important before we can get anything else done. The mental health, the physical support, because a lot of things has happened over this last year. And listening, as Gail and Susanna both said, is also important. But we haven't talked enough about how do we take care of ourselves as individuals in order to even get to that research, in order to even get to anything else, because that's what's been affected. People are feeling isolated, even though we have this, these conferences and these peer connections facilitated by Zoom and other web conferencing tools. We need more than that as human beings. We really need to reach out and have these kind of relationships with people where we can see them physically. And I think not enough of that is happening in terms of the social, as well as mental and physical well-being that we've not addressed. And the universities need to understand that before we can do anything else, we have to address how do people reinvest in the institution in a way that they did before COVID happened, because it's different. How do they actually ease into it where they can feel comfortable in that space? Some people's research has stopped completely. One of the things I can say that we did really well on this campus is the research in terms of graduating, gradually, bringing people back in a little bit at a time, as what you said happened on your campus, Susanna. I think our Vice Chancellor of Research did an excellent job there. But I just feel like we still have to address the mental health issues and what's happening in the isolation that's occurring. And the university needs to understand that leaders, we all have mental health needs. We're human beings. And I think sometimes we forget that life happens. We have to be a little bit more flexible, and that we're human beings. And I don't hear enough of that happening, as though we are robots, as though we are machines in these spaces, and we have to produce like machines. And I think COVID has really shown us that, even though we might be these organic machines, I call us, but the reality is that we're not the inorganic machines, and we have to consider our individual lives before we can think about anything else, and the impact that COVID has had on us as people. Yeah.
Jess, I would just add one short thing, and it picks up on something Susanna and Gail mentioned, and that has to do with the tenure clock. I was in a meeting with a group of other presidents, and as you can imagine, there's 6 guys for every 1 gal in that kind of room, right? But they were talking about extending the tenure clock and making it opt-in. And I did point out to them that women and minority faculty are much more reluctant to step forward and say, I need more time, even if they do need more time. And they are worried about being thought poorly of because they needed more time, even if it's entirely legitimate. And so we chose at UTEP to extend this tenure clock and to make it opt out. So it's presumed for everyone, but you can opt out of it if you want to. And that means, we're 37% of our faculty are Hispanic. And there's pretty good evidence that this pandemic has disproportionately affected women in the workplace, professional women particularly. And so, and of course, the pandemic has disproportionately affected minorities. So can we create a situation where we don't put the burden on the minorities and the women in the room to say, I'd like an extra year for my tenure consideration? So I know there's a lot of APLU folks on the call. Think about that when you make your policy on tenure extension, and how it's going to look if you are, tenure is such a stressful time anyway, but how it's going to look if you're the only woman civil engineering professor in the department. Do you want to be the one that has to ask? And maybe we shouldn't put them in that position.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think we're, Dr. Murphy was right on, and just starting us off of, we're at the beginning of our recovery, both in all sorts of ways from this. And so this is long work. And I just like to also encourage us to think about, what did we learn and how can we make some lasting changes, like Dr. Tettegah was referencing, based on what we've learned in this recent experience. I'm going to get off my hobby horse because I am not a panelist. So let me go back here to say, for our next question, what first sparked your interest in STEM and or both, either, broadening opportunities for women and people of color in STEM? And how does that spark motivate you in doing the work you're doing today? And we're going to start with Dr. Tettegah there.
As I mentioned earlier, I was always interested. I think some people are just born with an interest. I know, and sometimes that interest is fostered or supported in different ways. As a young child, I was always curious. I wanted to do these things. I grew up in the segregated South. My teachers, all of my teachers were Black. And it was in very supportive, as I mentioned earlier. And one of my teachers really sparked an interest and encouraged me to pursue my dreams, as I say, building that confidence and that self-efficacy. And I would say that I went on and kind of moved out of STEM in certain ways. I became a teacher. I was a K-12 teacher. And I actually taught math in middle school, but maybe math education, and as well as other courses. And it was a passion. It was always an interest. And I knew that I didn't want to veer off from it because I felt the pain in my heart when I left it, so to speak, and started doing other things. And I would say what really got me interested again, I got involved when I was a faculty at California State University. I was there, I was teaching courses in social justice, because I've always been interested in social justice around these various issues and broadening participation. And I took another position at the University of Illinois where I got back into STEM because I said, I really want to get back into teaching some STEM. And I became a part of the curriculum and instruction STEM program and started teaching courses in technology, especially around equity and broadening participation. So that's something that really sparked my interest. Is once I started teaching it again, I said, I really like this. And I'm also a lifelong learner. I continue to go back to school and do work, did a fellowship at Harvard in fMRIs because I wanted to do more work in neuroscience. And I've just been motivated. And it's not been anyone in particular, I can say. It's something that I felt. It was something that was a part of me. And I knew I had to continue to do it. And here I am, I'm still doing it. I'm in Black Studies. And often you don't see a lot of departments or programs in Black Studies with a focus on STEM. But I wanted to continue the work that I was doing because I thought it was really important to make sure that other people got this knowledge in some way. And I said, well, I'm at a Center for Black Studies. I'm the director here. Why don't I integrate STEM in it? Because that's my passion. And I started to pursue that and collaborate with faculty that are in STEM programs and And we're building STEM programs at the center, research programs, where undergraduates can actually work with other faculty, as well as do some work with me on my National Science Foundation funded work. So I would just say it's just been a passion. And I don't know that I could ever have thought of anything else. And sometimes it's just like when you're walking down the road and then it gets, you know, to a fork and you walk down the wrong side, you come back, you back up and you go back on that other path. And I would say that that's what's happened to me. And that was the spark that motivated me. It was just always something that I loved. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So
Dr.
Sharon, there
Murphy?
is a
Oh.
Sharon, there is a special place in heaven for middle school math teachers. I'm just saying.
Thank you.
I wanted to add something about how do we reach girls particularly, but also minorities in that critical middle school and high school kind of age, and what can we do? And because while women have made tremendous progress in a lot of different professions, they're still underrepresented in science and particularly in engineering. And just a couple of thoughts. One of the ways is universities that we talk about engineering and science when we recruit students, I think doesn't appeal to a lot of girls. And there's some pretty good research on this, that a disproportionate number of boys, teenage boys, are satisfied by solving a problem. And there's an overlap in the middle, but a disproportionate number of girls want to know why the problem matters. So if I talk about, show pictures of robots and rockets and blowing things up or whatever, I'm, you know, often appealing to what a teenage boy, a disproportionate number, might be interested in. But if I say, do you want your town to have clean water? Do you want to help find the cure for Alzheimer's? Do you want to make new cars safer for every family to drive in? Then be an engineer or scientist. And I'm talking to girls about why the problem matters. And that makes a difference. I also think that creating groups where the minority is the majority, so you feel like you belong, is important, and that's particularly important for girls. At South Dakota Mines, we had Girls' Day, and we did it with the Society for Women Engineers. We brought 1,000 middle school girls to invade the campus once a year, and then we had to expand it to 2 days, and we did all kinds of cool, fun stuff and put professors on beds and nails and let students pound on them, and it was just a blast. But it was groups of girls having fun together with science and engineering and making goop in the chemistry lab and just having fun together to make a memory of what it meant to study at that really cool engineering and science place where I went with my friends. And so I think creating those opportunities and things like Girls Code and other programs like that can really hook girls at a critical time, because once they've declared their major in college, it's too late. We've missed them. And so it happens much younger. And that means that public universities have to be constantly reaching out and working with K-12 education.
Heather, I just think you hit the nail in the head, and what you just said resonates with me on a personal level, because I think if I had been exposed to what you just shared, my career might be very different. And I'll tell you why. There's a fact about me that not many people know, and that is that my first major in college was physics. And that was because I fell in love with math, thanks to a middle school math teacher, Sharon, that changed my life, as I mentioned earlier. And then I fell in love with physics in high school, and to the point where even when I was in high school, I was taking physics at a community college. And my dream was to specialize in thermonuclear physics and work for NASA. That's what I wanted to do. So I went to college. I was a physics major. And within the first year, I felt like I did not belong. And I didn't belong because I could not see myself in any of the faculty that I had. I was the only Latina in many of my classes, and I felt isolated, and I felt like my thoughts and what I could contribute really didn't count. In the meantime, I was working part-time as a Spanish tutor for my peers. And between classes and after classes, I would run and I would do this tutoring where I would get the most joy because I felt like I was a really good tutor. The students were incredibly grateful, and I could see myself among the faculty that were coordinating the Spanish tutoring. So guess what I changed my major to? I changed my major to Spanish and linguistics. Why? Bottom line is because that's where I found my sense of community, my sense of belonging, and that's where I was able to see others that looked like I did. And I think that that just exemplifies what you shared and why it is so important that we really consider how do we contextualize how we talk about STEM disciplines? How do we attract young women? And then once we've attracted them to college, how do we retain them? How do we make sure that when they do get to our institutions, we are creating that community environment, that cohort environment, that support mechanism that will help them navigate the barriers that they might encounter and continue on and move on to where they need to be. So thank you for sharing that approach.
Yeah, maybe just picking up a little bit of a thread there. You know, being a computer scientist, I've worked with trying to improve the gender balance in computer science for about 25 years now. And sometimes it's a little depressing because it takes a long time to change. And I think one thing we also do is our society kind of paints either you're an engineer or a scientist or STEM, or you're an artist and creative. And we don't have that many people that are out there saying you can be both. And you don't actually have to choose hard one or hard another. And we heard from Sharon how she's gone back and forth. And I think that's a really important message to get across too. I really struggled when I was deciding what to do in university because I wanted to do English, wanted to do physics, and I wanted to do computer science. And it turned out if you became a computer scientist, you could do all those other things. You could take those courses. You never had to really grow up because you could be building software to do financial things or to be helping cure cancer, to be doing something else. So it was kind of the path of least resistance in a way, that you could still be imaginative and creative and create these new things that had never been created before. But you could also do that using your logic and your science and your hard sort of skills. So I think the more that we can get across the fact that it's not a hard choice, you can do both. And you can do information visualization that has creative aspects to it and draws on creative and performing arts. So you can bring those things together and do something really unique. And maybe that would help us attract more different kinds of people into the STEM disciplines.
I wanted to respond to Heather, something that you mentioned, and everyone else has talked about that. I think the mentoring process and the opening up the door, so to speak, that it is so important, especially with girls and groups. But we have to understand also that with underrepresented groups, many times it's not including even underrepresented groups. You might have a group of girls who are all white, and a Black girl is not going to feel comfortable there. Depending on that person's background, we really have to start looking at the differences as well within individuals, you know, the cultural aspects of it. Because I believe they, unfortunately, in higher education, I see that it has one culture and one way, even though many times we don't think we have one way of doing things. When we start to look at the practices, they're very, very similar. And we don't have room, we've not allowed room for these diverse epistemologies. And that to me is so important because I might see the world completely different. I have a different schema. And we know we have to look at the differences in schemas and culture and their interactions and interdisciplinary as well as intersectional identities. It is absolutely necessary. We can't even lump all girls together. We have to say, you know what? This girl is an artist as well as a computer science, but this girl might just be a biochemist in the way she's thinking about it. And also have an exposure to everything that's available. Because we, you know, students come into these spaces and we force them to think a particular way. We're still doing it in K-12, we're still doing it in higher education. How can we diversify our curriculum in order for it to be accessible to everyone? And we don't think about that. Not everyone is comfortable with an equation. Some people might like to have a simulation to help them learn something, or you might have to build upon it. And that's some of the work that I've been doing, is looking at engineering content and how can we diversify the content where it becomes a personal learning environment so everyone can access those things. And also, and as well as be themselves. You guys talked about authentic selves. That's the other part of it. If I go into a room and I'm speaking Ebonics and I'm being my authentic self, how will that be received? Am I automatically going to be marginalized because no one is willing to understand my language? No one is willing to understand where I'm coming from. That happens a lot to people of color, in K-12 as well as academia, and we're forced to assimilate to what's already there. So I'm just trying to figure out at what point will our universities, these intellectual spaces, be open enough to have everybody's voice heard? And I think that's so important when I see women coming into the institution, when I see, other underrepresented groups, and then, the triple and double bind. If you're a Black woman and if you identify as a member of the LGBT community, so you got a triple bind. So, how do we make space for those individuals coming into these institutions that are so cemented? That is something that I struggle with. And I say we all need to be our authentic selves and not ascribe or subscribe to the assimilation roles that we do, because all of us do. We've made it in the university and we've assimilated to some extent. Otherwise, we probably would not have been successful. I can assure you, if I walked in initially speaking Ebonics, being my authentic self, 100%, that I would have been rejected. And it would have also been assumed that I'm not very intelligent, because my intellectual ability would have been associated with my language. And I always say, the way you speak has nothing to do with your intellect. It really doesn't. So when are we going to have space for people to bring in their way of being in the world in these spaces so we can really create and be innovative and not keep duplicating? So, I mean, it's just really, it's something that's very passionate for me. And I often think about that. And I would like to see institutions of higher education more open-minded about individuals and how individuals are in the world, and not force them to conform to their way of being. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. I think that call to open our spaces to everybody is so important, right? And I think it's something we're all struggling with, and it's sometimes hard to even name what the problem is and what the steps forward might be, but I appreciate that call to action. We had one more planned question, but I was thinking we might want to turn to the audience questions just to give us plenty of time to engage with those, because I'll say our conversation has sparked interest and responsiveness from the audience. So one person just wanted to acknowledge, Christy Mannering, that idea of accidental leadership and being thrown into things to fix something was really a resonating term. So thank you for that, Dr. Rivera-Mills, and you really put that concept into words for her. Let's see, I'm gonna scroll through here. There were two different questions that kind of emerged as a result of our conversation around COVID-19 and the impacts and the way we might make space and support folks after we've made our initial accommodations. So both of them kind of rely on the fact that either peer reviewers or departmental reviewers, we can put the policies in place at the institutional level, but there are all these other actors who are going to step in and perhaps take a different approach. So what are suggestions that you all might have for how we can further institutionalize or further document, further embed this mindfulness about the individuals and the experiences they had in COVID-19 as, say, we put people through the evaluation ringer going forward on the faculty track?
So let me attempt to provide a perspective on that, and keep in mind that I'm in the process of actually figuring that out myself. So what I'm going to share with you is really my approach, and I have yet to see what that's going to yield. But I think that for example, with what I talked about, having this document that has kind of a menu of best practices, this is where, for me, shared governance is critical. And in order to explain that, let me just add that for me, shared governance is about shared responsibility and shared accountability as well. You cannot leave the responsibility and the accountability piece out of the governance piece. It just doesn't function that way. So the heavy lifting was done by a central university committee that really took the time to research and gather this information. As I shared, that document was presented by me and the Vice Provost of Research to all of the academic leadership, which include department chairs, directors, associate deans, etc., with the charge that they needed to really take this document and look at their own departmental level documents and see where it was. In addition, that document was shared with the University Promotion and Tenure Committee, which is part of the University Senate. And it was shared with the entire Senate as well. And it was discussed at the Faculty Council Subcommittee of the University Senate. So first is you need to communicate whatever it is that you need to do or the charge very broadly. And it needs to have both top-down support, but more importantly, bottom-up engagement in that conversation. And then you have to really work to engage and collaborate with those governance committees that are charged with approving departmental documents or on promotion and tenure to review those standards and figure out, what is the minimum that we need to ask people to truly consider here. And then finally, the piece that we haven't fully rolled out yet, but we're beginning to roll out, is that professional development piece where we can provide, we have a department chairs academy, leadership academy that meets every month. How do we provide support for department chairs? And how do we provide a space for conversations and thinking for the committees, the promotion and tenure committees, example in this case, so that we can create a common language and a common understanding of what the principles might be and the standards and the best practices that we really want to consider. And so it's really about creating a shared understanding, a common language, and honestly, a common commitment that this is something that matters to us and that we are really going to commit and engage to reviewing what we have done before COVID, what we need to do due to COVID, and more importantly, beyond COVID, as we move forward to improve those mechanisms that are in place right now. So that's where we are right now, and it really becomes collaboration and partnership and consistent and frequent communication and dialogue across multiple levels, both vertically and horizontally, to be able to create that culture, which we know takes time, and that common understanding and commitment around these issues.
I guess I can weigh in with a couple of thoughts. I think they really pick up on Susanna's. I think we have to raise awareness of those unequal impacts and different kinds of impacts that Sharon was speaking to earlier. So we need to make sure that everybody's aware that we just can't imagine that there's one kind of impact that people had just because they have young children, they had daycare problems. That might not be true for them, but maybe they actually had elder care problems that they were dealing with. The second thing is to be open, to have communities that are open to the fact that things are going to look different. And Jess, to your earlier comment, I wonder if there's a real opportunity to make change at this moment in time. So there have been calls from various associations in the past. I know the Computing Research Association at one point had been advocating that for promotion and tenure. Maybe you just list your best 5 publications or your best 3. And it's about the impact that some of your best work has made, not about the quantity. I do remember going up for one series of promotions at some point and being told, I didn't have enough invited talks. Well, I had 3 kids under 5. I wasn't going to be spending time on the road to go give invited talks. And people would say, just add on an extra day to a trip. It's like when you have little kids in the house, you don't just add on an extra day to a trip. So I think it's for all of us to really stop at this moment and say, are the kinds of ways that we're evaluating people, are they the right mechanisms? Maybe we can really think about looking at people's promotion and tenure packages differently, or what they're putting forward as part of a grant proposal, or what kinds of books they're publishing, or how they look if they're open access, and really stop and think about it at this moment in time when we faced an event that hopefully none of us will ever see again in our lifetime. And hopefully with the things that we're learning, we're going to be able to move forward for the next kind of event that happens with a lot more thought, and having learned, as you said, Jess, from what we've gone through now.
I agree with everything that everyone said on reevaluating what's valued. That's basically what you're talking about, Gail, is what's valued and how it's valued. I mean, it's a very interesting process. We all know, even from each university, the tenure excuse me, process may be a little different, but it's pretty much the same. And when we think about the policies and how these things happen, as well as the practices, some people, they just continue the same practice. And I agree, it may be time to look at changing some of those practices and looking at what's valued and how people are valued. And, you know, because many times with a lot of people of color, things are not valued in the same way. And it's all often diminished. And it's also done with women. It's been done a lot throughout centuries, the diminishment of and what happens with our work. And if it doesn't ascribe in a particular way. So I think, yes, it is time to start rethinking the values that we have in institutions of higher ed, and how we can have an impact, and not just a local impact, but a national impact. Because when we look at things nationally, where women are in the United States and underrepresented groups, we're far behind many other countries in terms of impact. Thanks.
All right. Thank you for that. I think that was helpful for folks to think more deeply about that. We, throughout our conversation, right, we've talked about the importance of mentoring and mentoring for students, mentoring in the K through 12 environment, mentoring for faculty to faculty. I think mentoring for staff as well is important at our institutions of higher education. How can we better reward mentoring and that investment in time and people institutionally? We know often that isn't what we're rewarding. So how do we do that?
Jess, let me start out by challenging something that you just said, or maybe building on it. It's not just about mentoring, it's about championing. You know, we can have relationships where we mentor other faculty members or other administrators, but what really matters is when a decision is made or an opportunity is opened up to say, hey, you know, I've been working with Jess on this project and she really you should interview her. I don't know if she's exactly right for what you want to do, but she's exceptional. And it would really matter to me if you just give her an interview. Or when someone calls you and says, Jess, I'd really like you to apply for this fellowship. And you say, gosh, I can't, I'm committed next year. But let me give you 2 names of people who you really should talk to about this. So it is the championing, not just the mentoring. And too many women and minorities will walk in and not sit at the table. And we need to bring them to the table.
That was an excellent challenge to the notion of mentoring. Thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts about how we further strengthen championing and mentoring on our campuses?
Just briefly, I want to add that, you know, we have to think broadly about different types of mentoring, you know, like Heather mentioned, but also, and I'm going to say this, realizing that many institutions are facing budgetary challenges. You have to strategically invest in the areas where that mentoring can happen. And it can look in different ways for different institutions. One of the things that can happen for emerging leaders, and this is usually a smaller group of individuals, is the idea of creating faculty fellowships at multiple levels of leadership in your institution. Okay, I can have a faculty fellow work with me The president can have one, some of the vice presidents, deans can create faculty fellowship positions. And the idea is that you have someone, as Heather said, that's championing and that's helping you think through broadly at that institutional level what is happening. So that's one thing. The other thing is thinking about the faculty's full arc of their career, right? It's easy to think about junior faculty, but the fact is that we have mid-career faculty, senior faculty, who also need different kinds of support in different ways. And making sure that we're creating, whether they are writing groups, whether they are larger collective groups. We have a program here that I'm just really excited about, and it's been here for a long time, and that's a faculty leadership academy. And a new orientation, new faculty academy. So thinking about how do we onboard new faculty so that right away we have that network of support around them, and what should that look like for our mid-career faculty? What should that look like for others? And I'm focusing on faculty because those are the examples that come to mind, but I don't want us to forget graduate students. I'm concerned really in our current time, as I read a number of articles, there are institutions that because of financial challenges are finding themselves in a situation of having to reduce graduate programs, reduce graduate assistantships, reduce startup funds for new faculty. And even though those are short-term and obviously necessary ways of trying to meet the financial challenges that many institutions are facing, I think we're going to be seeing long-term effects in terms of the pathways down the line and how that's going to impact particularly women and women of color again. So thinking about how can we strategically create mentoring spaces that might be different than the traditional one-on-one or in addition to around our institution at different levels so that we can meet the needs of people that might be in a variety of positions and times during their career. I think that doing some of that will really, again, provide some options for people that may not have the opportunity to go into an ACE fellowship or some of the more national fellowships. What can we do right on our campus right now to make sure that we are supporting those faculty and GAs and others?
I absolutely love what Heather said about championing it because it's just so true, right? Is to really start thinking about mentoring and championing together and something that we can get a lot of personal joy about. So if I think back at my career, some of the times that have been most rewarding is come from mentoring, come from having had a conversation with somebody, and maybe it wasn't a formalized mentoring relationship, but maybe it was a conversation at a conference or a conversation with a student after class, and later they come and they say it made a difference. And isn't that why we all are kind of involved in what we're involved in, is to try to make those differences in people's lives. One of my colleagues in industry has a concept and a talk out there which builds on other people's work about laddering. And one of the things we have to remember about mentoring is that often the best mentors are the ones that are kind of closest to where you are in your career, and then somebody a bit above, but maybe not somebody what you perceive as, 3 steps above. And so how do we formulate those relationships? We've had a try mentoring program here at UBC for a long time where entry-level undergraduates are paired with senior and senior are paired with somebody from industry or somebody, a faculty member. And those kinds of relationships work because you start to see the different ways that you can achieve something, and it doesn't look like one big, massive step. So trying to put those programs in place where people have an opportunity to get the joy that you get from mentoring and to be able to do it maybe at an early stage where they're mentoring just a peer, and then are able to, through ladders, get access to different kinds of individuals. But I think we should always remember that there's a lot of personal joy that can come from mentoring, and it doesn't always have to be an entry on a piece of paper.
Thank you for that. I'm going to transition us to a new question. I know Dr. Tettegah wanted to jump in too, but hopefully maybe you can find a way to connect into this. We're all at APLU is made up of public research universities, many of them land grant universities that have missions, right, to serve our communities, to educate our localities, workforces, all of these competing missions, right, that we're trying to achieve. And so Dr. Andrea Tyler asks, we often talk about that K through 12 and higher ed connection, but what about industry? How do we think about the challenges in bringing a more diverse STEM workforce and women in STEM into industry as well? And how might we, as public research universities, develop those relationships and build those partnerships across these different sectors to build those relationships? So it builds on what Gail was just sharing. And Dr. Tettegah, if you'd like to go first, I'm happy to give you the floor first, but you can also pass.
It's okay. No, I think about right now, we're developing a program for underrepresented groups, for women and students of color, to work with us through the center. And we're partnering with and attempting, I should also say, to partner with other institutions and non-governmental organizations to provide internships for these students. And I think that creating multiple spaces, and that's, I was going to respond to the mentoring part. I think, as you all mentioned, there are different types of mentoring. There's the professional mentoring, there's almost like a social mentoring. You know, how can I welcome someone into my group where people can feel safe? But I think exposing these students to all these different organizations and institutions, just exposing, these are the things we have available. How about you go and spend some time here? Similar to what the federal government program has with Pathways, where these internships, they can go to these different places and try them out to see if they like them, and things touch on an area of interest. And having that diversity to, you know, because a lot of times we have different ideas about STEM, right? But remember, girls were coding in MySpace and didn't even realize they were coding. We have chemistry. What about makeup? You know, I don't want to stereotype, but makeup is a chemistry. And I know the L'Oreal Foundation, they often recruit women and men, everybody, to come in and learn how to deliver their perfumes and the makeups and stuff. So I think exposing them to a variety of areas to help them to understand there's more to STEM than what you see or the way it's been told to you, and making them realize that even a chef is also chemistry. It's about chemicals. And how can we bring those arts into these areas so people can feel like, yes, I can do both of these. I can understand chemistry and I can be a chef, or I can be a makeup person. And I think that's some of the ways that some of these things can happen, is partnering with these institutions and having them to break down the barriers by putting students in these spaces that often have not been in the spaces, and not retaliating against them because they happen to be a person of color or happen to be a woman, or marginalizing them. You have to have groups of people going in, because you know when you're the only one, it's hard to go up against some of those things, some of those barriers that keep you down and tell you don't belong here in so many ways. So I think having groups of students go out and visit and work at these different organizations would help.
I just want to add something to what Sharon has said, because I think this is complementary actually to her ideas about students and internships and how to place them there. We have launched a program called Skills Infusion, where what we do is we provide externships for faculty to be able to go out and work with corporations and industry and understand the needs of those corporations, those industries, so that they can then come back and infuse that knowledge into curriculum and actually begin that transformation within the curriculum. And we have found that to be an incredibly valuable experience for our faculty to be able to do that. We have had professors from areas that you may not think, you know, would be excited about these opportunities, but faculty from the humanities going into a corporation that deals with computing and technology and science. And they've been able to create those very important connections around transferable skills and bring that back. And when you look at that and you look at how these industries and corporate partners value diversity and how important it is to follow up, to build on Sharon's makeup example of, I'm sorry, but diversity is critical in makeup. Okay, you need to understand different shades of skin. You need to understand what to do with what. Otherwise, we pay the price, right? So it is critical to see the value of adding that diverse perspective, that diverse experience. And then how do you bring that and infuse that in the curriculum so that you can do that? And our goal has been for all of our colleges to have those externships available during the summer for faculty. And we have relied on alumni who are now in those wonderful corporations, those wonderful industries, and created advisory councils, corporate and industry advisory councils that work with us to provide internships, not just for students, but externships for faculty to have those experiences. And I think that has been eye-opening for all of us to really think about our work and how we do it and how we can really connect in a transdisciplinary way.
All right, we're in our final 10 minutes here of the session. So I saved a question that we'd actually been kicking around for the last one. Marcela Alvarez shares that she's currently pursuing her master's degree in agricultural education. And she wanted to know, if you had to go back while pursuing your bachelor's degree or any phase of your career, what would you do differently? So lightning round, what would you do differently if you could go back?
I'll take that one first. So when I look back on the things professionally that I've accomplished along the way, I was always very focused on the work. You know, the problem being solved, the organization that needed to be turned around, whatever it was, and less focused on the people who were with me. But when I look back on it, that's what I remember, is the relationships. And building relationships of trust all along the way creates a web and weft of professional relationships over time that will continue to lift you up. And I don't think I understood that as a young professional, and probably spent less time on the relationships than on the work. And I would do that differently, I think.
That's perfect. I'm just going to echo what Heather has said. The value of relationships, the value of building both your personal support network as well as your professional network early on, being intentional about connecting with people, overcoming shyness. I was timid, I was shy. I always felt like I was bothering someone. Boy, if I had to go back, those poor professors wouldn't know what to do with me, because I would be knocking on all their doors, asking questions and trying to connect to resources and just picking their brain. And I think that if there's something I could tell graduate students and undergraduates is try to overcome feeling timid and knock on those doors and ask those questions and take advantage of that time that you have with those professionals, both on campus and off campus, to build those incredible relationships that Heather's talking about, because they will serve you well in the future.
Those are both great answers. I think just to add on to that, if I could go back, in addition to doing all those things, I would also try to take a lot more different kinds of courses, just like explore the various kinds of disciplines that exist on campus and just really revel in the time to get to learn things instead of worrying about the future all the time.
I think that if I could go back, it would depend on whether it's with the knowledge that I have now or the knowledge that I had at the time. But I would say definitely I would reach out to people. If there's nothing better than reaching out and connecting. I tell all my students the number one most important thing you can do is to reach out to people, and it's networking. Networking is so important because it gives you those opportunities that you may often miss. It exposes you to a lot of different things that you may not know exist. And I would have gone back and probably, I would say, knocked on more doors, reached out to people that I could identify with in terms of common interests, maybe perhaps someone that was a Black biochemist at the time. I would have reached out to them, because often when you reach out, they reach back. And that's one of the things about it. People don't realize that we're all willing to help, but you have to reach out. So definitely networking in those relationships, valuable than anything you can learn in a single course.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing those final pearls of wisdom, particularly about the value of relationships, community, and networks in kind of all parts of our lives. I want to say thank you on behalf of APLU to each of our panelists, Vice President Gail Murphy, Provost Susanna Rivera-Mills, Dr. Sharon Tethica, and President Heather Wilson. It's just been such a pleasure to learn from each of you. I feel very inspired. I hope I might call on you in that mentoring and connection and networking space going forward now that we've spent this hour and a half together here. We just really appreciate you giving of your time to our broader APLU community. So thank you so much. I also just wanted to take a moment to thank the many colleagues at APLU who supported today's effort. Those include Kaylin Jackson, Ali Maniglia, Justine Jew, Robin Parent, Jeff Lieberson, Howard Gobstein, Bernard Mayer, and APLU President Peter McPherson. It really does take a village to get one of these events together. And then finally, our event today could not have been a success without our engaged audience who fed us so many wonderful questions. I think we still had a few we didn't get to and some amazing comments that I'll make sure to share with our panelists afterwards. You know, our members, partners, and colleagues are so valuable to us and make this kind of event what it is. So I want to say thank you all. We'll be giving you back at least maybe 3 to 4 whole minutes to your day. So wonderful for there. And we hope that you'll all join us for our upcoming Earth Day commemoration webinar next month, hosted by our agricultural colleagues. But thank you all today, and we so appreciate all of you being here and celebrating Women's History Month with us.